Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vickie Lan, and in each episode, I and a guest will unpack a trope with an eye for world building, character development, or narrative structures. You can also join the conversation on TikTok and Instagram. For those times when the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Okay, Angela, if you could pick any fictional animal to have as a pet in real life, what would it be?
Falcor from the Neverending Story.
Oh, wow. You had that one ready to go.
I couldn't have, but
I didn't even tell you that one. You just knew.
Nope. That was, I didn't even have, no, that was it. That's.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, Angela, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. How about you go and introduce yourself to our listeners and tell them about you and any projects that you're working on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so flattered. My name is Angela Alvarez. I'm a Colombian writer and journalist. In English, I write fiction under the name Angela Sierra. I'm recently a podcaster as well. And thanks in no small part to you. I just wanted to recognize that. You've inspired me so much. And I'm currently agented, and I have a manuscript on sub and one that I'm waiting for feedback on. I'm not nervous. You're nervous.
We're in the same spot, you and me. We're in the exact same spot.
We are. And I, like you, I had a manuscript die on sub, and I had to heavily re-edit it. And I'm like picking my projects. I liken my brain to somebody who wants to pet the puppies. I want to pet all the puppies. My brain is full of puppies, and it's hard for me to pick one puppy to pet. I want to write all the stories. I want to do all the things. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, best of luck to you. And I've listened to your podcast and I really enjoy it. You talk to people who are either from Colombia or have started their new life in Colombia, right? And
yes, foreigners, Colombians living abroad and foreigners living in Colombia.
Okay. Yeah, I really enjoy it. And I've already told you this, but I'll tell you this again in front of our listeners. But I love your voice. Your voice, when I first heard it, I thought, oh my gosh, it sounds like Siri or some, like professional voice. So I just had to say, beautiful voice.
Thank you. If my voice sounds familiar, you might have heard me somewhere because I do like voiceovers. And so if you get PTSD listening to me, it's because my voice was on a learning platform. So I was a teacher.
Oh.
Don't forget your project. That was me.
I love it.
Yeah, that's me. You probably heard me. For English, dial 1. That was me.
You have the perfect voice for it. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, let's launch into this. So, we're here to talk about LatinX representation in books. So before we get into it, tell me why you chose this topic, what it means to you.
So speculative fiction has like two big areas, right? Future and technology. And seeing myself in speculative fiction and people like me and people who look like me and sound like me and have names like mine literally means seeing myself in the future. So when you see other people's visions of what the future might look like, and you don't see people like me in those visions, they are literally telling you, I imagine a world without you. And when we see technology and we don't see Latinx people as being participants of the creation of those technologies, you're telling us we don't think that your contributions are important enough to visualize it in something like this. So you're like, whatever, insert name of whatever movie you want where they launch somebody to space, they send somebody to another planet, they build a time machine, and nobody that looks like my dad is there. Nobody that sounds like my mom is there. You're telling me there's no room in my imagined future and in my imagined technology for you. Ooh. So to me, it's super important.
Especially when it's like futuristic movies where like they've sent a colony out to repopulate and you're like, oh, okay, I guess we got left behind.
Yeah, so it's not just inclusivity for inclusivity's sake, it's actually making space for me in your imagined future, especially when those futures are utopian. And you're like, oh, so your ideal world doesn't include me in it. Good to know.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you for that perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, so then how would you when we get down to it, Latinx representation is seeing people of Latin origins in stories.
That's yeah. That's we could say that. That's a good working definition.
Okay. All right. So let's kind of set the stage here, create the foundation. What does Latinx representation look like right now in speculative fiction?
Okay, so right now there's a lot of things that we're doing well. One of the things that I'm excited about is the fact that we're having conversations. We're having open conversations like this one
Hmm.
about what representation really means, and we're invited the people that we want to represent to be a part of those conversations because
Okay.
that wasn't happening before.
Yes, I
That was
do
like,
feel that. No, I feel like that was been a huge thing, especially during the pandemic. There was a lot of, I think, civil rights, a retreat back to like having to
yes,
work on our civil rights again, and a lot of people of different origins were having that conversation.
yes. I think that one of the things that, and you've touched on this in previous episodes. I think readers, first of all, younger Gen X, Gen Z, millennials, for sure, are much more savvy consumers, and they are absolutely fearless and adamant, and about the defense of their own values in what they consume. So as we have more educated and more savvy readers and consumers in general, those readers are championing the authors that they feel are authentic, and they are ruthless in
Hmm.
canceling their cancellation policies. If they can sniff out inauthenticity a mile away, and when you're dead to them, there's no coming back. So they're supporting indie writers, and they're supporting a lot of grassroots efforts, and they're supporting a lot of smaller presses, and they're really doing a lot to indicate to big publishing what they want and what they want more of.
Have you
But there's
seen?
still,
Oh,
pardon
I'm so
me,
sorry. You carry on.
there's still a lot to be of work to be done in traditional publishing spaces, especially in the pre-publishing phase. And what I mean by that is that um, something like 95% of all books written in the English language are written by white people.
Hmm.
And that includes stories that are written from the point of view of minorities. And so what happens and what people don't really realize is that these writers who are big earners maybe don't have agents or publishers or editors that at the pre-publishing stage can or want to or know how to tell them this is maybe not your story to tell.
Mm.
And so we have people taking up space where they don't belong. And I mean physical space, like your book takes up space on a shelf, right?
Mm.
And a lot of those writers, because they're, because of who they are and the advantages they have, they don't see their privileges as privileges. But what happens is that these writers end up having seven-figure advances, and their marketing teams get a lot more money for promotional material, and they get the big displays in the big bookstores, and they get the fancy swag bags at events, and they get invited as speakers, and they get to go to symposiums and to book fairs, and they get booked on shows in legacy media. And so readers see those things, and they think that that means that the story is authentic, and it's really just an endorsement of the writer and not the story. And so other writers and minority writers struggle to get seen, and we get a five-figure advance, and we're we're told to consider ourselves lucky.
Mhm.
We don't get nearly we don't get the same support, and so our books don't get the same screen time, and so that's where we're missing a little bit more. And part of the reason is because most of the people who make the decisions about what gets published and what doesn't are members of the majority culture.
Let's talk about some of the harms because some people might say, well, I wrote this book and it was with best of intentions and it's about a person of a different ethnic origin than myself and I'm a good writer and yet, all these things. But what are let's describe some of those harms. What are we missing when it's not someone of that actual origin telling the story?
So I'm talking specifically about when you write a story from a particular point of view. I'm not talking about when you include secondary characters, which I think is great. Um, I'm talking about assuming the point of view of a minority that you don't belong to. And the way I think about that is if you don't present, you can't represent. Because identity is an emotional thing and research is an intellectual thing, right? So people think that they can overcome it with enough research or with enough talent. And when you point out to somebody, maybe that's not your story to tell, what they hear is, I just have to work extra hard and read more books so that I can wrap my head around it. But the problem with that is that writing is an emotional exercise. Creativity is emotional, and you are always in control of your own imagination. So you can't think your way into somebody else's life experience, emotionally speaking, because a lot of what it means to be a minority person, a lot of the harm and a lot of the pain comes from places that you don't expect.
Mm.
And you can't surprise yourself in your own head. So when you
Mm.
talk to people, which I'm sure you do in your everyday life, because you too, you're Asian American. So when you talk to people, they feel the descriptions are like, and I was completely shocked by this, and I was surprised by this, and I was caught off guard by this reaction. But when you're thinking about it, you can't catch yourself off guard. So those things are not going to be natural representations and organic representations of what it really feels like.
I thank you for that perspective. I think, yeah, speaking from the Asian American half, so I am half Vietnamese, half Irish, is knowing what I do know about like my mother and people in Vietnam, and I don't feel at all confident to take on the representation of some of like even my mother's perspective. Like I know that there's so many differences between me as biracial, her being an immigrant that is, Vietnamese coming over. And so I am sometimes always surprised at the confidence that someone who has zero experience in, the culture can feel presenting it, I guess is the best way to say it. I'm
Well,
totally insecure about even trying to go there.
we have a saying in Spanish, ignorance is bold.
Okay.
So a lot of these people don't know how much they don't know. And
Okay.
again, they think it's an intellectual exercise or an exercise of the imagination.
Okay.
And it isn't. And especially when you're taking up space. And I think it comes down to something that, why would you want to tell my story for me? Why don't you trust me to tell my own story? Because I was having a conversation with an author. And she's like, no, but see, if we meaning um, white Americans, if we don't tell those stories, then those stories don't get told. I was like, listen to
Um,
the hubris. Listen to yourself. Why would you trust yourself to tell my story? Why don't you view me as an equal? Why can't you think that I am just as talented as you are,
mhm.
just as good a writer as you are? And if you see that a minority writer is struggling to get their stories out, then support them. Don't tell their stories for them. Make sure that that writer has everything they need in order to tell their own stories. And
Mhm.
instead of saying, oh, shiny, I'll take it, I'll do it. No, you support us, but it's this idea that why would you think, yeah, the hubris involved in I can do it, I can just imagine it, I've read 2 books about it, I can do it.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So then pivoting a little bit to the Latinx representation that we have now, authors, are there any that really stand out to you that you love that you kind of see as an inspiration?
Oh gosh, so many. So I love Ingrid Rojas Contreras. I love her. She is doing so many wonderful things with magical realism in nonfiction. I mean, she's just goals. Silvia Moreno Garcia, can't get enough of her.
Oh, yes.
Daniel Jose Older, I love him. I have feelings because I took a class. I took his class on Skillshare, and I, in that class, I wrote a story, and that story wound up being published. And it was because his voice, he was so unapologetic and so authentic and so himself, and I love that so much. But also, I'm also really inspired by not just Latinx writers, but also writers that put a little bit of themselves in their writing and their culture. I love, for instance, Daniel Nayeri, Everything Sad is Untrue. I loved that book. I loved it. I love We Hunt the Flame. I love, so many. For instance, Adam Silvera and Aiden Thomas. I particularly like their take because they do something really interesting, and it's that their heritage comes through in their books, but their experience as first gen and mixed race and mixed heritage writers really shines on the page. And that's such a different experience from mine. And both of those writers particularly say really nice things about Colombia in their books. And so it's so great for me as a Colombian to read a book about my country where there's no nasty stuff. There's like
Oh,
phoenixes and dragons, just wonderful things.
yes.
And I love them, and gancitos. And I love their books. I love them for that specifically. But just, anybody who is able to take their heritage and just color the pages with it, I admire.
Yeah, well, when you mentioned that about the lens that we have seen Colombia by people who are not Colombian, like think of Hollywood, right? We just said
Mm,
exactly that, where you associate it with drugs, and that's what people go down to do in the thriller movies. And it's nice to have someone who actually can speak from the origin and highlight all the beautiful things about it that doesn't
mm,
have an internal bias.
not just that, but like if you the beginning sequence of Mr. and Mrs. Smith
Mm,
makes me want to cry because
mm,
right before you and I got on this call, you were like, "Oh, is it cold?" Yes, it's freezing. I'm in Bogota. I'm freezing. But you see movies that depict Bogota and everybody's like wearing flip-flops. Like, ma'am,
mhm,
you would freeze. That's not accurate. Oh, look at the palm trees. No, no, there's no, nope. That's not Bogota. We're in the mountains. It's misty and mountainy, and
mm.
like little things like that. And that's kind of the thing where if it's not your experience, you're not going to know those little details.
Yeah, no, that is really important. Okay, then here's another broad question while we're just talking along the broad umbrella of Latinx representation. But are there any specific cultural or historical elements from Latinx communities that you feel are underrepresented? And I'm sure that that's a laundry list. So like I guess what are some key things that you want to point out?
Okay, one of the biggest things for me that is missing currently in most representations is our sense of humor.
Oh.
Because I read somewhere that the people who face the harshest realities are usually the funniest because humor is a coping mechanism and we need it. We're very funny. And I think
I
that that's
find you
missing.
funny.
Thank you. I mean, our humor is so, it's so important to us. Family is something that is incredibly important to all of Latinx people. Our extended families and our sense of family and our sense of loyalty to our families. I would love to see more of that. I also think that the immigrant experience is so important because everybody that I know has someone who left. Every family has
Wow, okay.
someone missing from them. They have friends that are in various degrees of, migration. Some people went because they got a better job offer and they live very well, and but some people has struggled, and migration is such a huge part of that, and the loss and grappling with all these things and family and all that. One thing that I think is really important that I don't see enough of is nuance. And by that I mean there is no Latin culture. Latin
Hmm.
is not a place, and Latin is not a language. And so people use Latin, Hispanic, Latino interchangeably, and they don't really consider how different a Colombian is from a Mexican and how different a Mexican is from an Argentinian person. And so they use broad strokes Latinx people and broad strokes Latinx stuff, and the nuance and the differences, like when they say, "Oh, this is a Colombian character," and I hear them swear, I'm like, those aren't the swear words we use. And just think of how, for instance, I'm writing a character from America and my character's from the East Coast. You're like, okay, but where? From Miami, from Boston, or from New York? Because those are very different vibes.
Hmm.
And the same is true for us. And the same is true for like in your blog post, I said I was a fan and I mean it. Well, you're all just Chinese anyway. No.
Yeah.
And do you like if you were gonna represent Asian, actually Asia, first of all, Asia is not a shape.
Yeah.
um, and Asian is really broad. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Because the people from it's so different. And I think that that's missing nuance.
I love that you brought up the perspective of families where someone left. Because for my own personal experience, of course, my mom's an immigrant, so we're on the opposite end. And everyone in America that came over from Asia they're the ones that left, and that's what we think about. We think back to the motherland, and I'm going on a homegoing trip with my mom to Vietnam next year, so we
Oh,
think
beautiful.
I'm very excited. So there's that perspective, but you're right. There is the flip side of that experience. And I don't see a lot of that. And I would love to see more of that, just that new perspective. What can you share a little bit of that not trope, but perspective, I guess you can say, of what is it like when you have that kind of missing part of your family?
Well, we came back. So we were the ones that were missing and came back.
Okay.
And so it's different. But for my friends, and I talk in my podcast, I talk to my friends that are away from me. And so we're
Mm.
like, I haven't seen you, my bestie Hector, on the podcast said I haven't been able to touch you in 3 years, and I almost broke down crying because it's true. I mean, we have screens and ways to stay in touch now that we didn't have before, not when I was a young child living in the
Mhm.
United States, but the feeling that there's a part of you missing always, no matter where you go,
Mm.
and you're always a part of you is your family's never complete. And so since family is so important to us, we get together and there's always, the empty chair,
Hmm.
the plate that you set that nobody's going to sit in front of.
Wow.
That's really hard. It's really hard for us.
Yeah, the immigrant experience being that the person left for a reason, and then and there sometimes when my mom's reason not going back, but then you always have to think about the people who stayed, who are still there, and they might be enduring whatever it is that the immigrant family member chose not to
Yeah.
endure.
But then when you leave, you also feel like you're a traitor because
Oh
and
yeah.
sometimes you get treated like a traitor. Why
Hmm.
didn't you stay to help?
Hmm.
And then there's, the people that leave that send I don't know how to say that in English. Remesas, they send money from abroad. And so, you're working your butt off in order to send money back home.
Hmm.
And it's and another thing that happens since I've been on both ends of the spectrum, I was an immigrant and then I came back.
Hmm.
Um, Another thing that happens when you immigrate is that the outlines of your national identity get blurred because it becomes a porous membrane. And so, as you just said, you're Asian, but your mother is Vietnamese.
Hmm.
She is Vietnamese, and she's specific. And so I'm Colombian, but when people immigrate, they become Latinx because they start
Hmm.
they start interacting with other people that are kind of on the same boat. And so I was speaking to a young writer. Her name is Manuela Arboleda, and she was telling me there are parts of stuff that I don't know if they're Colombian or Mexican or Venezuelan, and it stops mattering. You don't really know what you're talking about, and is this food mine or is this food theirs? And there comes a
Yes.
moment in which it doesn't. It kind of all gets lumped together,
Yes.
and
Uh-huh.
that's also a fascinating phenomenon, and also an important part of the experience that's worth talking about, because
Yes.
it's all these and the people. Your mother made the decision, like the generation that made the decision, but then there's a generation that has to live with that decision.
Hmm.
Like you can never come back. You can
Hmm.
never go. You will never be Vietnamese.
Yeah. No, it's so true. Like there's definitely even if I don't feel like I can be, she'll remind me that I'm not. You know what I mean? Because it's very clear.
Exactly.
There's a very clear difference between when you're from like the main, the homeland versus when you're part of the diaspora.
Exactly. And you'll never be so that you're not Colombian enough, but
Hmm.
then you're also not a real American. And so there's this liminal existence, which is why I started the podcast. There's this we have in Spanish the niés. Niés is an expression that means neither this nor that.
Okay.
So it's a space. I always say that the closest thing in English is this nor, as in
Oh,
neither this nor that, but this nor sounds like a Norse god
yeah.
that is in cahoots with Loki to overthrow Odin or something. This snores, but it's the Niest, right? And it's a non-space, but it's also a fertile space
Ah.
because there's so much in there of not fully one thing, not fully the other.
Yeah, I interviewed from the Asian American episode. Her way of calling it was you're in the crack. Like you're in the crack, but you can't get out on either end of the, you're just in the crack. And I think
Yes,
about
but
that a lot.
there's flowers coming up in the cracks of the
Yes,
pavement too.
you're right. You're right. Yes.
So we are
Okay.
the flowers.
Lovely.
We are
Beautiful.
the flowers blooming in the. That
Beautiful. I
sounds
love.
dirty.
But do you see how like it's so nuanced and complicated that I can't even dream of jumping outside of the crack to represent someone that's not in the crack? You know what I mean? Like,
But being in the crack is super important. And the thing
mhm.
is, the people that are on the sidewalk can't see the crack either.
Oh
So
yeah.
I likened this once because I was talking to somebody. I was like, okay, being a minority, wherever you are, and there's different kinds of minorities. It's like you live in a hole, right? So
Mm-hmm.
everybody is standing at the beginning of the racetrack, like in the Olympics, and they can all see the same obstacles. They're like, okay, I have to dodge this obstacle. I have to dodge this obstacle. And they're seeing that we all have the same obstacles, right? But they're not looking behind us. They're not looking behind them because some people, in order to get to the starting line, have to crawl out of a hole.
Mm.
And so when you're a woman, you're in a hole. Like, let's just say that right now. Women start every day out in a hole. And if you have a disability, then that hole gets deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And if you belong to a racial minority, that hole gets deeper. And if you know, like there's religions and there's levels of the hole. And there's some people, their all of their energy is spent getting out of the hole, just trying to make it to the starting point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some people are just naturally closer to the starting point. That's not their fault, but they also don't realize that sorry,
No worries.
that other people are in a hole and they don't see the hole.
So then that is related to my next question, which is what challenges impact bringing authentic Latinx representation to fiction? And you covered one. Are there any others?
Well, there's lots. So there's those that belong to all of us and those that are just mine. Um, as a general rule, and this is weird, uh, I get policed about the use of Spanish a lot more than other people. So I've seen people, white people, can use words in other languages and get away with it because they sound cultured and they sound, savvy. And you can call this little bambino and it's fine. And people say things like, I'll do it for you gratis. And oh, that's so macho. But when I put Spanish in mine, they tell me there's too much Spanish.
Ooh.
They tell me it's too much, or they'll nobody knows what a bruja is, or nobody knows what this is. So I get policed for my use of Spanish more than other people using Spanish just like as a spice. So that's one that's hard
Oh,
for me.
that's part of that
Um,
privilege you were talking about, that unseen privilege.
yes, and people I think it was Daniel Jose Older that said, people watch entire entire conversations in Klingon or in Elvish and
Mhm.
not bat an eyelash. But you put, you sprinkle a little Vietnamese and then all of a sudden, it's just too much. I can't be
Mhm.
bothered. Um, a challenge for me specifically was to champion my own voice and sound like myself instead of trying to tell Eurocentric stories, which were the
Yeah.
ones that I started telling. When I first began writing, my characters were, I wanted to write about fairies and I wanted to write about trolls and I wanted to write about, the same magical creatures that we've all heard and dragons. And I want, my characters were in wherever, Springfield, USA. And actually, I owe a huge debt to a fellow writer named Carolina Pereira, who read an early draft of a novel. And she said, listen, your magical world is amazing, but your real world is so boring. And no wonder because it was based on a country that I only knew as a child. And I didn't have any real experience. I know what it's like to try to write about a country that isn't your own because I tried it and I failed
Yeah.
spectacularly. And she was like, and so I was like, oh, you're right. I should write about what I know. And so after that, all of my stories take place in Colombia, and my characters are Colombian, and the food is Colombian, and the feedback that I've gotten is a lot more positive. So in a general spectrum, yes, you're like, you the references. So people tell me, oh, I don't know who that actor is, or I don't know that song, or I don't know. There's so much that you don't know. And I get policed for that a lot. And on the other side, it was me, like me learning to do it, me believing in myself enough to write from a place of authenticity.
I imagine there are a lot of people who are minorities who feel that pressure to write about that very Eurocentric world. What advice do you have for them following your experience and now this world where we see publishers wanting to see more authenticity in their writers?
I think that the advice goes both ways. Stay in your lane because your lane is cool. Your lane is awesome. There's so many writers who have found, treasure digging in their own backyard. Chuck Wendig is American, and all of his stories are American. It's awesome. Libba Bray, and then Leigh Bardugo is talking about her own heritage, and so many. We talk about yourself and what you know. Write what you know, and if you're a minority writer, that's awesome too. That's going to be great. People are going to find that fascinating. Don't think that you have to. It's hard. It's hard to not want to sound like everybody else because there's safety in sameness, and standing out makes you an easier target. And I'm not gonna lie, sometimes feedback isn't great, but it's worth it. It's worth it in the long run for everybody because you're gonna have something that nobody else has, and that's your own point of view.
Mm-hmm. Let's expand on this to incorporate the part of this argument that always comes up, which is what about, and you mentioned this earlier, what about the side characters? Does this mean as a white writer, I can't incorporate anyone of diversity in my books? And what is your answer to that?
Honestly, I'm gonna tell you, your writing should reflect your life. So if your life doesn't have a variety of characters, if you don't have people, a Vietnamese friend and a Mexican friend and a gay Black friend and a trans friend with disability, then you're not doing life right. You need to start there. You need to live a life that is authentically diverse in order to write stories that are authentically diverse. Because when you have your best friend is Colombian and they come over to your house in fourth grade, they're going to say, well, why don't you live with your grandma? That is so weird to me. And you're going to have that experience. You're going to know what it's like when somebody from a minority, somebody different, your best friend, went to your house. You're going to have listened to them. You're going to know what they're going to say because you lived it. And when you, as a white person, go to somebody else's house, you're going to be like, oh, what are you eating? And your house smells different. And you have a hammock on your front porch. And this is weird. And you're going to be able to talk about that. So, live your life as diversely as you would like to have your characters live. Have a diverse life. I would start there because, if you have to go read about diverse people, if you have to go read about minority people, because you don't have real life experiences, then maybe you need to look inwards and have more of those experiences and seek those out.
All right. Well, thank you for that answer. I'm going to segue now into the creative aspect of Latinx
Great.
representation. I am really curious to know, how do you navigate the balance between telling stories that are grounded in the Latinx diverse cultures and creating universes and worlds that feel unique to speculative fiction?
If you think about it, there are a lot of speculative fiction worlds that, despite being speculative fiction, still feel very authentically belonging to a culture. Think about Doctor Who. Doctor Who is fantasy, but it still feels really British.
Mm-hmm.
Even the episodes that are not, somewhere centered in a way that, for instance, Star Trek feels very American. So it can be done. I think really good examples of that are, for instance, Vampiros en La Habana, which is by Jorge Padrón. It's a 1985, I think it's 85. It's an animated movie about vampires in Cuba, vampires in Havana. It is hilarious. It's so funny. It's so great. And it feels so authentically Cuban, but
That
it's
sounds
vampires.
fun. Vampires
It's so
in
fun.
Havana.
It's
That's
so
amazing.
funny. I don't want to give it away. Go watch it. But
Okay.
it's like there was Dracula had to go hide in Havana. So he's hiding from, there's a mafia undertone of like vampires. It's so good. Like if for instance, the Book of Life is fantasy, but it's very Mexican.
Mhm.
Guillermo del Toro has a lot of, it's fantasy, but it's culturally infused fantasy. So I do think it can be done. And if you look at, for instance, writers like Adolfo Bioy Casares and his novel La Invención de Morel, The Invention of Morel, it's beautiful and haunting and scary and very, very Argentinian in the way that he approaches it. I think Lost is loosely based on that book. And actually, there's a scene where John Locke is reading that book because it was based on it, the invention of
Oh,
Morel or Morel's invention. And for instance, you look at, Jorge Luis Borges and Isabel Allende and Laura Esquivel. And so there is a way to make fantasy still feel very authentically Latinx.
okay. All right. And it makes complete sense. I remember when I first started reading classics and fiction, Lord of the Rings, when I was a kid, and there are things that you just kind of assume are default depending on where you're living at the time and how you're getting exposure to books. But then you grow up and you realize Lord of the Rings is very British, right? So it's not,
Hobbiton could be, like right near between the Tower of London and Blackfriars Bridge. It could be right there.
yeah, exactly. And so kind of stepping back and realizing that just because our exposure kind of maybe sets what we think is the foundation of a certain genre, I mean, that's just a reflection on colonialism and the Western expansion, you know what I mean? But it's not so out of the norm to just shift that focus a little bit and world build based off of other cultures.
I think I would love more than I think that adapting a trope to a Latin American experience would be so cool. I would
Yeah.
love to see. I was talking to my husband the other day, and we were talking about dystopian futures. We're like, well, Bogota is a dystopian future. I would love to see just like after some sort of horrible thing that happens, and Colombians are fine because we're used to it.
Um,
I'd be like, we'd be like third world countries would be like so chill. Developing countries would be like, what do you like? No, it's the same.
That's such a good point. I mean, that was kind of some of my book that's currently on submission. It's a apocalypse, but the main character is with her Vietnamese mother, and
Oh, there you go.
it's a very different experience than what you would expect to see in the mainstream like Hollywood movies. And it can be so simple, right? You take that trope and you just apply it a little differently, and it's a new experience. Okay, so that segues right into my next question, which is, are there particular speculative tropes that resonate with Latinx experiences in a unique way?
Okay, I'm Colombian.
Okay.
So, magic is my birthright. Magical realism is
Right.
is, it's handed to you as, it's yours. I think magical realism specifically is something that lends itself very nicely to be interpreted. I've read magical realism by other authors, and I think Alice Hoffman is wonderful the way she does it. But what I see that might not come across to other people is that magical realism for other people is an aesthetic, right? And for
Mm.
us, it's a coping mechanism. It's
Ooh.
a sense-making mechanism. When you read magical realism by a Latinx author, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Ingrid Rojas Contreras, who I already mentioned, Jorge Luis Borges, like all of these, for us, it's a way of dealing, it's a way of looking at the harshness of our own realities and trying to make sense of it, because it's kind of like looking sideways at something because it's so horrible that you can't look at it you can't
Mm.
face it. So for us, magical realism is it's almost it's almost subversive. It's almost a way of um you know talking about things that if we didn't represent them, they would be erased, they would be marginalized. And it's a way of reclaiming that. Magical realism in particular, I think, is super important. And in general, I just think that you can have so many tropes subverted. I talked about the vampires in Havana idea, but I think that immortals struggling with bureaucracy would be hilarious. I
Oh,
would
I
love to see immortals, like, or aliens landing in Colombia and being ignored because there's a football game. I would love that. Just because it would be so funny. I would love like Mexican vampires in the Mexican Revolution and a Chilean werewolf infiltrating Pinochet's regime, and like a Colombian inventing a time machine so that they can go back in time and avoid their loved one from being killed in the Avianca plane that was brought down by the guerrilla. It's a form of resistance almost when you take those tropes and you subvert them. So I don't think that, I mean, aside from magical realism, I don't think that there's like a single trope. I think it's more the idea of what would this trope look like in a different place, and not just putting a token brown character in the same way, because it's a
Yeah.
way of looking at it
Yeah.
instead of just, peppering, adding diversity for spice.
Hmm.
And it's actually sitting down and thinking, what would this look like? What if aliens landed in Vietnam? Like Violet Coopersmith, am I saying that right? And is a Vietnamese writer, and Build Your House Around My Body. So beautiful and so interesting. And it's like really, it's that. It's like,
Hmm.
okay, what does this look like from where I'm standing?
Yes. Well, and what you highlighted to me basically is the trope isn't the end game. The trope itself
Yes.
is not the end game. It's about the characters and how it breathes life into it. That's why many times people are, oh, someone took my little idea, my description of my book and wrote their own book. And I'm like, no, 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 you can take the same trope and approach it completely different from different angles. That's the beauty of it. The trope is just the packaging, the
Exactly. And
filler.
that's what that comes down to, authenticity. Like I remember when I
Hmm.
was having an early conversation with my agent, and we were talking about the magical system of my novel. And he was like, but I don't understand. Like, is magic secret? What is it? And he couldn't get and I was like, no, but you see, magic in Colombia is different. It's not just putting a Colombian character in a trope. It's like adapting it to it. Because for us, magic is our last resort. Because where do you turn when the
Wow.
government has failed you, when nothing works, which is what a lot of people who live in developing countries feel like, when you feel that you've been abandoned by everyone in God, when everything has failed, when you look at hardship and you're like, where's the justice? You turn to magic. And so our take on magic is going to be different. So it's not just putting a brown person in a white story. It's starting with a character that is complex and multidimensional and real really
Hmm.
real, and then telling the story from there.
I love that. That is so beautiful. That is so
Thank you.
beautiful. I love that. Thank you so much. Okay. All right. Moving on to industry related questions.
Oh dear.
How can writers and the industry work to ensure that Latinx stories are not only included but thrive within the speculative fiction space?
That's a really good question. So one of the things, of course, is stay in your lane, stay in your lane, and support people who are trying to tell their own stories. Trust us to tell our own stories and do that. The one of the best things, is consume stories written by Latinx authors. Make sure, talk to your library and your bookstore so that they have our books on display all year and not just in Hispanic Heritage Month.
Mm.
But also hire us as speakers. If you and other people want to get together to maybe pay for somebody to go because, you can't always make it to the events. It's expensive. There are a lot of additional expenses involved in travel, not just room and board, but also you needed to get a visa in some countries, and it's so expensive. And so we don't get to go to the festivals, and we don't get to go to the Comic Cons, and we don't get to go. So like, if people can sponsor someone from a minority and say, come on, we'll pay for you, or pay them to be speakers, or pay them to be in symposiums and in panels. And, there's so much so that they can promote their work, and so that they can go to all of those things and make connections, which are so important, because we are not, we don't get to go to the schools, and we don't get to go to all those places. So we don't get to meet other authors who then become our friends and champion and exchange stuff. For me, it's been particularly difficult to find people to read my stories, because I write in English, and in my daily life I don't encounter people who speak English very well, or who read it well enough in English to be beta readers of my work. So
Mm.
those things are something that you can, okay, let's bring somebody in. You can help, and by championing those stories, we can create an ecosystem, because I see a lot of people trying to put Spanish in their work, and then the Spanish is misspelled and it
Mm.
doesn't sound natural. And so you end up with this word salad. Like, people don't speak like that. I went to my abuela and I had some galletas, and she told me that my camisa had a yellow mancha. I was like, we don't talk like that, man. That does not sound, that doesn't sound right. But the reason that happens is because, again, there's not an ecosystem to support these people. There's a whole bunch of stuff. And then another thing that you can do is just be really generous, and reach out to somebody who has a podcast and tell her that you like her voice, and make her feel like a rock star, and share your platform with her. And that is so generous and wonderful.
Oh, thank you for that. And I agree wholeheartedly. It's about the community, it's supporting your community. So thank you for including that. Okay, and when we were emailing originally about this topic, you did mention language and how the use of Spanish is basically not the best in certain translations, right? So from English to Spanish. Do you want to
Well,
speak on
in
that a little?
translations, not so much in translations, but like authors that are trying, maybe authors like you, like I don't
Uh,
know how great your Vietnamese would be, but you can ask your mom and your mom
mm,
will help you.
yeah.
But children of the diaspora, for instance,
Hmm.
and first gen mixed culture, third culture kids don't always have somebody to ask. And
Hmm.
their grasp on the language is not great. So I see a lot of mistakes in those books, and it's so sad. A lot gets lost in translation. Now that you mention it, a lot of the humor gets lost in translation. So that's something that's. I think that we're moving more towards interpretation versus translation, but
Okay.
we need people who really understand the nuances of the culture. Like I said, nuance is really big because um, the way US Americans swear is not the same way that Irish people swear. It's not the
Mhm.
same. And Canadians swear differently. And like so when you're reading a
Canadians
book,
swear?
they do.
I'm intrigued.
Yes, I imagine there's, hockey and maple syrup are involved. But it's people that don't understand the nuance. So it would be great if you had, I don't just need, a Spanish language editor. I need one specifically that knows about Cuban Spanish or Colombian Spanish or Chilean Spanish. And the thing is, those ecosystems thrive when there's something to feed it. So if there's a demand for those services will be offered and those people will get paid and that'll be great. But I think it's a part of the support system that we need to create.
Hmm. All right. Well, my gosh, thank you so much for joining me here on the podcast. This has been a very, very fascinating conversation. I feel like I've learned so much. Thank you for
Thank you.
sharing it with your wisdom with me. Is there any final remarks? Oh, actually, I wanted to ask, did you want to share at all anything about the book that's on submission?
Well, right now, I have a book on submission that's called The Day Hope Returned to Puerto Liebre, and it's about a couple of sisters who fake a series of miracles in order to expose the wrongdoings of the people in power in their small town. Um, and since you were asking about challenges, for instance, I've been told nobody cares about Colombia in the 1950s. Nobody cares about a Colombian story that doesn't have narcos in it. Nobody cares about that's not a sexy, what was it? That's not a sexy place. Colombia in the 1920s, Colombia in the 1950s. Nobody cares about historical YA set in Colombia because, nobody thinks of the 80s as being different as the 80s that you know. So like
Oh, wow.
I wrote a couple of historical YAs and they've not been, you know, it hasn't really landed well. And like I said, I'm waiting for feedback for the one. I don't even know if this is not on sub yet. So I don't know. But this one is about grief and magic because, as my mother died in February. So
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I thank you. I started writing about grief and I wanted there to be magic to deal with that grief.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a story about grief and magic and my agent has it right now. And
That
hopefully
must
we'll
have
be
been a
out on sub with
very,
that.
that must have been an amazing book to write. Very therapeutic, I'm imagining.
It was both, it broke my heart and
Hmm.
it glued it back together. My
That's
agent has it and we're hoping to go out with it on sub maybe later this fall.
okay.
So
Good
the
luck.
title, it's a working title. I don't know if I can say it though.
It,
You know
well,
more.
but you could say working title.
The working title, because I love the title. The working title is The Bruja's Guide to Grief and Magic.
Oh, I love it.
And I
See, and
wanted
even
to
if I
put
didn't know what brujas meant, I would go, "Ooh, what is that?" and look it up
what is
because that
that?
sounds really interesting.
Well, I figured that if somebody picked up a book that had the word bruja on the cover, they would be less upset by finding Spanish in the book.
Yeah,
So that to me was a big filter. Like if you've picked up this book, then you're one of mine. You're my people. Welcome.
yeah,
And then let's start there. Because sometimes people are like, oh, well, I didn't expect it to be set somewhere else. And no, you're getting it from the beginning. So that
yeah.
one, I have high hopes for that one.
All right. Well, I'm thinking of
And then
you.
there's the
Best of
book
luck.
Unbound, though. That
Oh
is
yeah. Okay.
Unbound: Stories of Transformation, Love, and Monsters is actually free to download. And that was the first book, that was the first story that I ever had published in English.
Okay, very exciting. So our listeners, go check out Angela Alvarez. Like I got that right. Thank you.
Yes,
Okay.
you did. That was beautiful.
And her book, Bound, that is available.
Unbound.
Unbound. Thank you.
It's an
Unbound.
anthology. It's a collection of stories. There's several writers. We have New York Times bestselling writer Emily Collin in that, and Lisa Amowitz, who's also a YA writer, and Heidi Ayarbi, and so many. It's a collection of stories, and mine is among them.
Very exciting. Well, thank you again so much. Any final remarks?
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your platform. I'm a true fan. I've been a fan for I opened my TikTok account 2 years ago, and you were just starting your podcast, and
Oh,
I've followed your journey, and I'm excited by everything that you're doing, and grateful that you would share it with me.
oh, thank you. And your podcast. You want to share that again?
Yes, my podcast is called When Home is a Foreign Word,
All right.
because it is.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, listeners, thank you so much for tuning in this week. And I'll see you again next week. Bye.